opportunity. Okay, don't be intimidated by all the fancy text in front of you. We will not be reading every single one, but they're all there for you to check out later if you'd like to. Whatever I was able to find in English online, I did. Anything that was crucial that I didn't find online, I translated myself. So it makes it easy to follow along. Okay, so the subject is love every Jew, literally. Literally with big explanation point, like for real? Every single person? So it's a nice thing to say. It's a nice slogan when we say we love every Jew. But then when we think of it practically, it becomes a little bit more dicey. And then it becomes even more dicey when we think of it legally, as in like halachically. Every mitzvah has parameters. Every commandment has like specific things you're supposed to do. A sukkah has to be such and such a size, and kosher has such and such rules. Everything has specific rules. So what's the rule for love your fellow Jew? What do I have to do? And if we're going to introduce an emotional element, not just practical element, but an emotional one like love, then it gets even more dicey. Maybe not to comprehend, but certainly to try to live out. That becomes something much more difficult. So we're going to look at some of the texts that discuss this, and what we're going to basically come with is two sets of classic texts that seem to contradict each other, and then two ways of resolving that contradiction. So I'm simplifying all the texts right there. There's two sets of primary classic texts, one that seems one way, one that seems the other, and then we'll try to reconcile them in two ways. The first one more practical, the second one, the Hasidic, more on the emotional level. Okay, so now we see where we're going. So let's look at the first set of texts. The first is the verse which says to love your fellow Jew, right? You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart, reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him, okay? You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am Hashem. I am the Lord, yeah. So the next three texts, we're not actually going to read them, but they're there if you can check them out later. It gives you the technical definitions of what you have to do. The general principle is actually, there's two principles that come together. The general principle is, don't do unto others what you don't want done to yourself. That's the general principle. So, as you can see in the text there from the Rambam, if you want to look at it, it's kind of like, you don't like when people badmouth you, don't badmouth other people. You are scrupulous about your own money, be scrupulous about somebody else's money. You treat yourself properly, treat somebody else properly. That's the basic idea. And then the next text gets a little more detailed, visiting the sick, attending funerals, and things of that nature. Okay, so that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah says love your fellow. So the mitzvah does not say love every Jew, right? It just says love your fellow. So on page 2, you have, sorry? Well, that's the big question. When it says love your fellow, that's the Hebrew word, your fellow, love your friend. Who is that? Who is this friend? Is that everybody? Sorry? Some of it's Hebrew. Most of it's Hebrew. Some of it's Aramaic. Okay, on page 2.
That's the good news.
The good news. We're already on page 2. Okay, so on page 2 you have the Gemara in Pesachim. This is the Talmud in Tractate Pesachim 113b. I'm not going to read the whole text, but you can look at it later. It's an interesting Gemara in and of itself, just to read it in English. The bold there is the direct translation. The non-bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz's interpolated commentary, just to make the Talmud flow. It's not complicated commentary, just to simplify it. So you can read the whole thing if you want. It's very interesting. But the bottom line is that the Talmud there says that the rule is, in a court of law, in Jewish court of law, there requires to be 2 witnesses. Which means if you, as a single individual, arrive in a court and say something negative about somebody else, you've done nothing but to smear that person's reputation. You haven't done anything. Because the court can't convict this person because there's no 2 witnesses. And all you've done is just spread rumors about somebody. And the Talmud lists that as one of the 3 people that, quote unquote, God hates. The other 2 are interesting there. You can check them out. One of the...
He hates if you do Lashon Hara.
Yeah, Lashon Hara is one of his relations matters by another and testifies against him alone. Right? His testimony is meaningless, and he's the only witness. Consequently, he really gives the individual a bad reputation. Didn't do anything. So, and the Gemara relates a story of a fellow who saw somebody else do something bad. Tuvia sinned, and Zigud saw the event. Zigud arrived and said testimony, and the rabbi reproached Zigud. So Zigud complained, I don't get something. Tuvia is doing the sin and Zigud gets the reproachment. What did I do wrong? I'm just telling you a story that happened. So the rabbi said, yeah, because you just made me now look bad at this other person for no reason. I can't do anything because you're only one witness, so it's useless.
What does it mean not to get drunk? I mean,
Sorry?
On a Purim, it's an obligation not to tell the difference between...
Fantastic question.
So what does it mean?
It's a good question. That's what it says. I think it means something.
I guess if you get drunk.
I think it means often.
An alcoholic?
I don't know about an alcoholic, because that's already a sickness, but anyway. It's interesting nonetheless. Leave that for now, because it's not the subject of our discussion. But a good question. Okay, so then the Gemara, after the story, the Gemara goes on to say, if you look at the second class paragraph in English, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, that Rav said, although one who sees another committing a sin should not testify against him by himself, because all you're doing is spreading bad rumor about this person, he's nonetheless permitted to hate him. You're out to hate this guy because he behaved wrongly. And then, if you go to the top... Sorry?
This is in the Gemara.
This is the Gemara, yes.
It's not in the Torah.
It's the Gemara, but it cites verses, as you can see. It brings text proof from the Torah itself to back everything up. If you see a donkey who hates you, right? You see it brings the pasuk there to back itself up. And if you go to the next page, the Gemara goes even farther. Top the second paragraph there. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, not only is it permitted, it is even a mitzvah to hate him. As it is stated, the fear of God is to hate evil. So you have just a straight seeming contradiction. This is not yet the contradiction completely, but you have the Torah says, love your fellow. And here the Gemara says, you're allowed to hate the guy who sins. So what's the simple explanation? Well, that's what the word fellow means. Fellow means somebody who doesn't sin. So he's your equal. You're not sinning, right? And this is your friend who doesn't sin either. That's who you have to love. The other guy,
So it's not every joke.
at least not yet. Right? Okay, so, and indeed, that's the first text right there, the Rashbam, which is Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir is a grandson of Rashi, lived in France, and he writes on the verse, when the verse is, love your fellow as yourself, he says, it is truly, if he is truly your colleague, friend. However, if he is wicked, you do not love him. As even God hates him, as we know from the verse, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. That's the verse. Compare Pesachim 1:13, which is what we just read earlier. Right?
The third paragraph from the top seems
Yeah.
to be an exception that even if it's one person testifying,
Yeah.
if it's a person who's respected,
Meaning to your teacher. Which
only
means,
to your teacher.
yeah, so in other words, if the two of us, me and this other guy,
Yeah.
are both disciples of one teacher,
Yes.
I can go tell my teacher about the other student so that he can hopefully correct his ways. But that's the limitation there.
But don't we have a moral responsibility if we see something that's really bad being done
Yeah.
by somebody
Yeah.
to protect, let's say somebody who's, I don't want to say the wrong things. Let's say it's somebody who's a teacher or somebody who's in a position of authority.
And does something to harm somebody else.
Yes, to harm, and
Yeah.
therefore you have all the other students who are potential victims.
Yeah.
And you may be the only person who saw it.
So then you have a biblical obligation to go stop him and tell the authorities. Yeah, the verse is, you don't stand on your don't stand in the blood of your fellow. So if there's somebody who can cause harm to somebody else, you have to do everything in your power to stop
Even
that
if
person.
you're one person.
Yeah, for sure.
then it's not lashon
That's
hara.
correct. Here we're talking
Okay.
about you just see the
It's
person
fine.
misbehaving
It's
for
fine.
whatever
But it's
harmless thing.
hates him
Makes
as-
sense here.
God hates
It's
him.
pretty harsh, right?
Yeah, God
It's pretty harsh.
I'm sorry, I don't
So he's saying if
That's
it's something
I
that,
I don't understand. It says here, if you see a
Yeah.
donkey, if he who hates you lying under its road.
That's correct.
No, I'm confused.
It's a verse. Okay, that's a verse referring to that even though this person hates you, the person whose donkey is being crushed under the load, you still have to help that person.
Oh.
So therefore, the Talmud is assuming that the verse is saying you're allowed to hate the guy, and therefore the Talmud says, well, how are you allowed to hate the person? Well, that means you're allowed to hate some people. That's how the Gemara is using that verse to come to the conclusion that there's some people you're allowed to hate.
There are some people like to do.
That's what the verse is trying to. That's
says-
what the Talmud is trying to
It
deduce.
says, when you say referring to a Gentile who hates you.
So the Gemara suggests perhaps it's talking about a Gentile, and that's what it means hate. And the Gemara rejects that notion.
Okay.
And therefore it must be talking about a Jewish person who's allowed to technically hate you, or
Okay.
you're allowed to technically hate.
Okay.
So this is the Gemara's deductive reasoning to get to the point that you're allowed to actually
Yes.
hate somebody. We didn't want to go through the whole thing, but that's
Okay, I understand.
follow?
Yeah.
Okay. So the bottom line is that we come to the first text, which basically says that there's a limitation on love your fellow Jew. And it's limited to someone who is an equal in terms of good behavior. At least at this juncture, this is what we have. There are...
But then where is the challenge?
Okay, so this is one set of text, and then we're going to bring another set, which seems to contradict that, and then we're going to have the reconciliation, right? So this is the first half of the text, which interpret the verse to mean that we're talking about limiting love your fellow Jew to only someone who's equal. And now we're going to see other texts that go to the other extreme.
Yeah.
And then we have to try to figure out how to reconcile the two. This is where we're going. Clear?
Yeah.
Okay. And we're looking at primary texts here, right? So this is one, the Talmud. And then the other text is a commentary on the Talmud saying, the commentary on the verse, citing to the Talmud saying, well, when the verse says love your fellow, it means your fellow. And if he's not your fellow, he's just a guy who's a sinner.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit will be difficult to answer. Do different religious group support different views?
Very likely.
Yeah.
What can I say? Okay, so there's a few other sources here that follow the same pattern, but look at the bottom text on page 3. This is also from the Talmud, yeah? Which seems to contradict this.
So it says, if you're a student and you want to tell your teacher what happened, so you only tell your teacher if you know he's going to believe you.
Yeah, in other words, the three of you are, in other words, this is your friend who you know very well, and both of you are disciples of one teacher.
Right.
And you're telling your teacher, hoping that this is going to help correct his path of way. Otherwise, there's no reason to tell you. Otherwise, no reason to tell your teacher other than you're just ruining his reputation.
Tell him is to be able to help the other person. It's not just to
That's right. So, on the one hand, Talmud says,
the second person to hate him. You basically the point of
That's
telling
correct.
him is only to fix the
that's correct.
situation.
Or in the case that Gloria is talking about, where you're preventing the harm to other people.
Right.
Okay, so let's look at another text now at the bottom of page 3, which seems to infer the exact opposite, which is, so the Gemara there, I actually just sampled one, because this same principle that comes in the Gemara there is repeated a number of times throughout that Gemara, that the Talmud. The Talmud there is in Tractate Sanhedrin, where it's discussing the laws of capital punishment. And there, the Talmud goes at length to talk about how, number one, the manners in which you're obligated as a court to prevent anybody from actually reaching capital punishment, number one. Number two, it goes at length to discuss that even if you get to the point of capital punishment, you have to make the death be as painless and shameless as possible. That's what the Talmud says there.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understood. If you have sinned,
Yeah.
then you need to do the killing in the easiest way possible.
That's correct. If he got convicted to that point, yes. It has to be the most painless possible. That's the law. First of all, it says you have to try to avoid it happening.
It's not from it's the Gemara. It's not.
No, so the Torah says, for a number of sins, it says that the punishment is many stones. There's 4 types of capital punishment, but the Torah says about many sins that there's capital punishment, right? Now the Talmud has to derive how we apply that.
Yeah.
Right? So the Talmud reasons its way through the verses to come to 2 conclusions. Number one, try to make it as least often as possible. In fact, there are 2 versions of the Talmud. One version of the Talmud says that a court which does capital punishment more than once in 7 years, that's less often than Texas. You can bet that. If it does more than once in 7 years, it's an evil court and should be abolished. Another version is once every 70 years.
70?
70, which means a person could have lived and died as a judge, never done capital punishment, but his court will become an evil court by the next judge in that version. Because how many judges last for 70 years? Right? So you're talking about very, very, very rarely. At the same time, the Talmud also discusses the law of, if someone does make it to the point of capital punishment, that you have to make the death as painless and as shameless as possible. So I just selected one sample of that, and this is the sample here. And if you were to say that two forms of chastisement, both stoning and humiliation, should be done to her, it's talking about a woman who had an interesting relationship. So Rav Nachman says, the Rabbi Baravua says, the verse states, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's v'ahavta l'reach kamocha. Teaching that even with regard to a condemned prisoner, select good, i.e. compassionate death for him, or for her in this case. Therefore, when putting a woman to death by stoning, she should not be humiliated in the process. Which means the verse that says love your fellow as yourself even applies to a condemned, convicted murderer, let's say. Murderers get capital punishment, and the same rule of getting the most painless death applies to this murderer. So now we have 2 contradicting texts. You have the Talmud in Pesachim implying that if you see someone sin, you're allowed to hate them. And here you have the Talmud in Sanhedrin saying that a court which convicted a murderer after this whole arduous legal process where you're supposed to try to get the person off, and the guy finally made it to the end where he's actually going to get capital punishment, comes Talmud and says, hey, you still got to love him, and therefore give him an easy death and without humiliation. So which one is it? Does love your fellow as yourself apply to everybody, even the convicted sinner? Or is it limited to only the one who's your equal and friend, but the person who you saw sin, you're allowed to hate, and even mitzvah to hate? Clear? These are the two contradictory texts that we have to resolve. Following?
The
Okay.
Sanhedrin never actually, no one was ever condemned to stoning up.
There were times, yeah.
There were?
Yeah.
What?
People were condemned to capital punishment by the Sanhedrin. The Talmud talks about certain times when, there was rampant, too much crime, and the Sanhedrin had to crack down because people knew that you can get away with it because the Sanhedrin is lax, given the fact that the law is you have to try to avoid it as much as possible. So people were taking advantage of it. And the Gemara says that the Sanhedrin at some points cracked down and did use capital punishment.
It's interesting though that it's saying from an individual to an individual, it's kind of one perspective, but as a group, it has a different perspective. Like it's saying,
Meaning the best thing is a Sanhedrin is a group.
but it's saying like you have to, with compassion, you have to find the easiest way.
Yeah.
You still have to love them.
Yeah.
There is no hate, and yet from an individual to an individual, where no one else knows about it,
You're like,
so then
there's the contradiction.
So like,
There's the contradiction. This is the
like in
contradiction.
secret, you're allowed to feel one way, but in public, you got to feel a different way.
And moreover, there's another text which supports that even further, which says like this. So there's 3 verses here I quoted. It comes from Devarim. And there it's talking about, you can read it, a verse is talking about someone who is what's called a mesis, or madiach, which means somebody who intentionally drives fellow Jews into idolatry. So it's the worst form of sin. And the verse concludes there, do not assist or give heed to him, show him no pity or compassion, and do not shield him. And the verse that says do not assent or give heed to him is loy ta'ava. So it says, comments Rashi on the bottom there, i.e. thou shalt not feel longing toward him. Thou shalt show no affection for him, ahav, flipping around the letters to make it from ta'av to ahav. This is stated because it is said, thou shalt love thy fellow man as thyself. This man, however, thou shalt not love. Meaning to say, the only type of sinner that you're allowed to not love is the one who's gone so far as to push other Jews into idolatry, which doesn't seem as permissive as the other one.
That's the only one?
That's what this text seems to imply. So you have one text, this Gemara and Pesachim saying that if it's only someone who's your equal in Torah and Mitzvahs you have to love. If he's not your equal in Torah and Mitzvahs, you're allowed to hate the person. In fact, Mitzvah to hate the person. And then you have this other text that says, convicted prisoner, you have to love the person. And furthermore, the only exception is, there's one verse where the verse says, this person who went and made other people do idolatry, that person you're allowed to not love. Everybody else, you still have to love. So we have 2 sets of texts. One that implies loving your fellow Jews limited to someone who's your equal in good behavior. And the other set of texts that implies that it goes to everybody, even a convicted sinner. Someone who's convicted for capital punishment. Clear on the 2 texts?
But wait, you're saying idolatry is another.
It's not even idolatry. It's someone who pushes others to do idolatry. Which means, if you're following strictly...
That's another category.
That's correct. Which means if you're following strictly this text, and that would be the only exception to the rule of love your fellow as yourself. But you see someone, like the Talmud said there, licentious behavior. If you saw someone do that, you still have to love that person, according to this text, because the only exception to the rule here is someone who is pushing others to do idolatry. Right? So this is in the set of texts that seem to expand the definition of love your fellow Jew to everybody, with one small exception for that guy who's running around making everybody else do idol worship.
But it's funny that they're not saying, on the other hand, to try, like, if you're strong in your belief, why would the other person be able to affect you? So it's funny that they're not saying, like, to help him instead of hating him.
This person who's
Because
trying to do
you're not
idolatry?
doing- Yeah, because you're not doing, if you believe that you're going on the right path,
Yeah.
and this person is going in a path that's going to harm him. So if you hate him, you're not doing him any favor.
Yeah.
Where is the love?
Well, that's part of the question here. But also the truth is to become this,
Maybe that's
to be...
what Chabad was. That's what Chabad was about.
This is where we're going, right?
Exactly.
The truth is that this to become legally defined as this type of person who is classed as a mesis, someone who actually is successful in making other people do idolatry, will have already gone through many times of people trying to bring that person back. But it gets to a point where you're talking about, let's say, a cult leader. That's kind of what you're talking about. Someone who's get to the point where he's a cult leader and making a whole bunch of people worship, I don't know, the sun or something. That's what he's talking about.
So,
Which was unfortunately a common thing back in ancient in ancient times. Yeah.
I mean, today we don't have idolatry, but they say somebody who gets angry, it's a form of idolatry. And somebody who sins, it's a form
Not
of
in the legal definition, but in terms of like the thought process going into it, yeah. Meaning, halachically speaking, you couldn't take someone to court for getting angry and say, hey, this person's an idolater, right?
No.
So it's not legally that, it's more in
Legally,
the...
but emotionally it is. And
Yeah.
So, and love is an emotion. So
Yeah.
you're talking like apples to apples. You're not talking halacha.
A very good point, which is what we're about to get to right now. And so Elza's suggesting that there's a split between the emotional element of love your fellow Jew as yourself and the practical element of love your fellow Jew as yourself. And the next text we're looking at, which is all in Hebrew, you cannot find it in English, we're not going to read
Is
it.
that Hebrew or is that
It's Hebrew, but it's written in script. It's Rashi letters, but it's the Hebrew.
I have a question. So we were just
Yeah.
talking because there's Jews for J.
Yeah.
So if you have Jews for J and they're actively
Proselytizing.
proselytizing.
Does that count as this?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what it is.
So it's a good question.
Because that's like whatever it is, it's a group of people who are actively going after other Jews
To make them
try
follow
to get
idolatry.
them to follow
Yeah.
J, which is idolatry.
So it's a very, very good question. And many would argue that they do have that legal definition. I would argue, though, as others have, that they don't know enough about Judaism to get that classification.
So does Chabad still have the obligation to go after these people and try and love them and bring them in?
Yeah.
Because that's going against.
As we'll see.
Yes.
As you shall see.
Okay. 'Cause
Yes.
doesn't
As we
follow
shall
the
see.
text. Okay. Fine.
Rabbi,
Okay, yeah.
To make it more challenging, but it is interesting.
Yeah.
To think, does that mean
Mm-hmm.
that we are to love ourselves, and all the others, all the goyim, we're supposed to hate because they're
Doesn't say that anywhere here.
idolaters?
No, here it's talking about Jews. Here's talking about Jews.
But what
Specifically.
about all the rest? Because if you're let's say, how would you treat, if you treat like that somebody of your own kind that is straying, so people that actually are believers in other religion, that we consider idolaters, how do we supposed to feel towards them?
Yeah, it's not exactly so simple. Again, we're talking about not somebody who ended up serving idolatry. We're talking about someone who's leading a group of idolaters. That's number one. Number two, we're talking about Jews specifically, and the standards of what we expect of Jews and what we expect of non-Jews are a bit different. So it's not as if like all non-Jews of other religions are idolaters. That's very much not the case, actually. That's what she was asking about. Like Jewish missionaries, many would argue do fall into that category, and I would argue, as many as others have, that they don't know enough about Judaism to go into that class. In other words, this class is somebody who grew up with Judaism, understands Judaism, and says, you know what, I'm gone with this. I'm going with idolatry and bring a bunch of people along. That's not the case for people today.
But they have like this organization where.
But she's right, that's a good example.
So, that's what I'm saying.
Jews, but they're really not talking.
100%. So there's a legal definition called a tinuk shenishba, which means the legal definition of that is someone who at birth was taken captive. That's literally the definition. Tinuk means a child. Shenishba, which means taken captive. Oh, not nishba, like with the ayin, with a hay at the end, like shvuyim, right? Like they're taken captive, and so that's a legal definition to describe a Jew who never got an education with Judaism and therefore is not held accountable for the fact that they don't keep Judaism, right?
In the war. Like,
So
for
the-
example, when they would drop
yeah.
off a kid at a Catholic orphanage.
That was the classic example.
War, yeah.
Today in modern America, many, if not most, legal authorities today will argue that in modern Western society, where a Jew does not grow up with Jewish education, is
Same thing.
in the same category and that's not held liable for not knowing about Judaism. So that for someone like that ended up in a place like missionary for J, I don't know if they're classified as someone who deserves your hatred, even by that definition. That's what I'm saying. That's all.
Makes
Okay.
sense. Okay.
I hope that answers your question also.
Yes.
All right, so let's see. So we have two sets of texts at this point. We have the Talmud which in Pesachim, which told us that you're allowed to and even should hate somebody who's not your equal in Torah Mitzvos. And we have the other text which says that even someone who's a convicted murderer or convicted who knows what still deserves the verse V'ahavta l'reach kamecha and therefore deserves a most painless and most shameless death. So to reconcile this, we're going to take two approaches. One is something that Elza kind of suggested, which is we're making a distinction between the practical and the emotional. This comes from this rabbi here known as the Mahram Shick. Moshe Shick. Rabbi Moshe Shick is a Ukrainian rabbi, the 1800s, and the legend has it that his name Shick, which stands for Shin Yud, is made up of the three letters Shin Yud Kuf, stands for Shem Yisrael Kadosh. That's the legend, and the reason apparently is because he didn't like this idea of Jews adopting last names that are non-Jewish, and all of a sudden Jews are going to be identified by non-Jewish titles. So he took a last name that reminds him, Shem Yisrael Kadosh, the name of the Jew is holy. So that's Mahram Shick. And he quotes these two texts that we just read before, which seem to contradict each other, and therefore comes to the following conclusion. And he makes an interesting observation about the verse. The verse, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now, for those who know Hebrew grammar, if I want to say love your friend, I wouldn't use the word l'reacha. I would say V'ahavta et reacha. The verse says l'reacha, but it should have said et reacha, love your fellow. Et is best translated as a semicolon. V'ahavta reacha, love your friend, putting the word et. And the fact that the verse says the word l'reacha, love to your friend, therefore he says, the verse actually just means to behave cordially to the other person. V'ahavta l'reacha, show love to your friend. How you feel about the person, another story. But to that person, v'ahavta, love. That's his observation. And therefore he says, when the Talmud says that someone is a convicted murderer and you're giving them a pleasant death, or at least a painless death, that's because you're talking about behavior. It doesn't say that the Beth Din in their hearts are supposed to love him. Maybe they're not supposed to, because like the other text said, they know he sinned, so maybe they're supposed to hate him. But in their behavior, they're going to act cordially to him. And there's a very beautiful, practical way of reconciling this, which takes a very practical level in terms of, began at the beginning, that when we get into the legal definition, it becomes more dicey. But if we go with this definition, which I think is very, very brilliant, and that keep your emotions out of this. Love your fellow Jew is a very practical thing. Doesn't matter how you feel and how you don't feel, behave cordially. Which gets back to what we talked about before. What's the legal definition of love your fellow Jew?
Is ignoring
Don't.
part of the...
Sorry?
What about ignoring?
Ignoring? If the
Not loving their...
so if the alternative is confrontation, maybe.
Oh, okay.
Right? I guess it depends what the alternative is. If the alternative is good morning, then why ignore? Say good morning, right? But if the alternative is some confrontation, then maybe ignoring would be in the best interest of everybody there. I don't know. But each case you'd have to discuss with somebody who is familiar with the people and the case, and I'm not going to make a general rule.
Very pocket expert with you.
Yeah. But this way of understanding these texts, I think, is very interesting, very practical, and very nice, I think. And it has a nice little interpretation of the verse also. V'ahavta l'reacha, love to your friend. As in behave cordially to your fellow, irrespective of how you feel, or maybe even justifiably. Like take the other Talmud, which says that it's a mitzvah to hate the person. So the Mahram Shick would say, yes, mitzvah to hate the guy, and that's justified, and you're still going to behave cordially. That's what the Mahram Shick would argue. And that, I think, is a very nice interpretation.
Yeah.
Okay?
We've been teaching it for so many years, and I never noticed the difference.
The et v'le, that's right. But here it's v'ahavta l'reacha, that's right. Yeah, it's a very nice little... That's right. That's right. Okay, finally the last text. Sorry? I teach Hebrew. Until I read this text, I never did either. Until I found this Mahram Shick, I never noticed that either. Yeah, it's quite brilliant. I really like it a lot. Okay, so now finally, the last reconciliation is more on the emotional, spiritual level, and this comes from the Tanya. So this is Tanya Chapter 32. I have almost the entire chapter here written in English, and you can read it later. We're going to highlight certain parts of it. It's almost the whole chapter. It's missing part of it. But just some background to where we get to in chapter 32. One of the big innovations that Tanya introduces into the way we live as Jews is the notion of the two souls. Now, the notion of the two souls, if we're familiar with this idea that every Jew is born with two souls, an animal soul, or let's use the word natural soul, and the godly soul. Now, in classic Judaism, there is this idea of Yetzer Tov the good inclination, and Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Now, in the Tanya, he switches terminology and goes with Nefesh Hativit, natural soul, or Bahamit, and Nefesh Elokit, and the godly soul. Now, this change of terminology going from inclination to soul is not just semantics. There's a very deep reason. And that is, when you say good inclination and bad inclination, what you're talking about is one person who has conflicting interests, conflicting inclinations. It's number one. Number two is, not all my inclinations are good or bad. Some are just, I'm hungry. Right? It's an inclination to eat. It's not tov and it's not ra. But when you say nefesh hativit, natural soul, and nefesh elokit, godly soul, now you're talking about two things. Number one, you're not talking about one person anymore. You're talking about, as it were, two souls. Right? Not one conscious being that has two interests, two separate sets of consciousness. That's number one. And number two, when you say natural, now, what am I talking about? I'm thirsty. Well, that's natural enough, isn't it? Right? So, when we talk about the conflict in the words of Tanya, and we talk about the natural soul versus the godly soul, the conflict there is not classically between good and bad, but between my natural self, which is selfish, and the godly self, which is selfless. So, if I say, I am hungry, is that evil? Not in the classic sense. It's not in the moral relative sense. I am hungry is not evil. But I am hungry is driven by the first word, I. Right? Whereas the godly soul doesn't say, I am hungry. The godly soul says, I need to drink to serve God. Or, better worded, God needs me to drink so I can serve him. That's what the godly soul would be saying. Clear? Okay. So having said that, now we're talking about two separate things. Yeah? It says the Alter like this, that if we're talking about, if my focus in life is the natural soul, my natural self, my body, the one that says, I like to drink and I want to eat, inevitably I'm going to be competing with a bunch of other I's. Because I want to eat, someday, somewhere, is going to compete with that person's I want to eat. And therefore, to truly love somebody else, if we're going to talk not just behaving cordially, but even an emotional level, then it begins with thinking about what I think about my own life. If the focus in my life is what I want, even if it's not necessarily evil, even if it's just I want, because I live, then somebody else's I want is going to be competitive at one point. Right? That's what all like, just to keep it practical, all conflict, partnerships that come together and break up, essentially come down to that. At one point, our interests aligned, and then at some point, our interests stopped aligning and then became competitive, so we're not partners anymore. Right? So even when we were in partnership, it's because I wanted something, you were another I that wanted something, and at the moment, it happened to be that our eyes aligned up. So that was the natural soul that decided it's a good idea to come together. However, if my life is not driven by I want, but what does God want, then why is somebody else a competition? They can't be. Why would there be a competition? That's number one. Moreover, when I see the other person failing, and I know that they also have two souls, and I say, well, why are they failing? Because their selfish self is getting in the way, which, by the way, I also have one. But deep down, I know that there's a part of me that's not selfish, so deep down, they also have a part of them that's not selfish. And if I value the part of me that's not selfish, then I look at somebody else and I value the part of them that's not selfish either. And therefore, even if they're misbehaving, why shouldn't I love the person? It's only the natural animal soul here, the body, that's in conflict. But at the soul level, why should we be in conflict? Furthermore, is this clear so far? So we'll go a step further. The way the Alter describes the godly soul in chapter 2 is, we could think of it in two ways. One way which has two elements, better said. The Alter describes all Jewish souls as one big body, spiritual body, not physical obviously, but one big spiritual body. Now when you look at a body, there are two elements. there's one part that you could say is like the DNA. The DNA in the fingernail is no less me than the DNA that's in my brain. Both equally me, they're the same DNA. I think modern science can probably regenerate a whole me out of my fingernail. Maybe not yet, maybe in 10 years, I don't know. But something like that, because the DNA is the same. And then there is the function of the body. The brain has one function and the elbow has another function. Right? So the Alter Rebbe here in chapter 32 argues, if your primary here is not your selfish self, the part of you that's natural that says I want and therefore is computing, but your primary in your life is your godly soul, the part of you that wants the truth, and therefore the other person is not a competition, because that's what you see in them, then moreover, not only that, you should actually look at somebody else and say, well, I don't know if that person's godly soul is a brain and I'm an elbow, or the other way around. So for all I know, this person's misbehaving as a godly soul is far superior to mine. How am I supposed to know? And furthermore, we have the same DNA. The parable, he doesn't give this here, but elsewhere in Chassidus it talks about this idea that the notion of love your fellow Jew, or the notion of not loving your fellow Jew should be akin to my right hand getting upset at my left hand because my left hand picked up the water, not my right hand. It's ridiculous. The right hand would never get jealous if the left hand picked up the water. It's all me. So if what's primary to me is my godly soul, then the other person's godly soul is an extension of my godly soul. Where could the competition come from? How's it possible? It can't. So here the Alter Rebbe is taking love your fellow Jew as yourself quite literally. Love your fellow just like you love yourself. You don't favor your right arm over your left arm. It's one body. It's one person. It's one Jewish person. It's not a bunch of different Jewish people. And therefore the challenge of love your fellow as yourself, in the Alter Rebbe's view, is actually an internal challenge. To view my own life, not as driven by the selfishness, but rather driven by the godliness in me, and that's what I see in others, and therefore we're all essentially one. Now what about this text that says you're allowed to hate your fellow? So it says the Alter Rebbe like this.
But going back to that concept, if you
Yeah.
look at it that way, so they're not them, you're all the same person.
Right?
So saying to me there's a conflict of you can't love a fellow Jew as yourself if they're not, that would imply that you are not the same person. But what you're saying in essence is you are the same person.
So in other words, what the verse is enjoining you to say is transcend the part of you that sees him separate.
I don't know, that sounds like a stretch.
It's very difficult to do. It's a challenge.
But they are separate people. It's saying to
Right.
love your fellow Jew, not love yourself as yourself.
Well, first of all, it says love your fellow as yourself. The assumption is you already love yourself.
Yeah,
Right?
that's
the
already-
assumption.
That's already a big assumption.
The verse is assuming so, right? Love your fellow as you love yourself. So you already love yourself. But which part of me do I love? If the part of me I love is my selfish self, then it's going to be a conflict. If what I'm loving here, if what I'm nurturing within me is my godly self, then I'll love the other person the same way. But the same thing.
And if you hate yourself, you can hate everybody else.
Sorry?
And if you hate yourself, you can hate
And you have to
everybody
back up
else.
earlier in Tanya and learn how to discover your own godly soul. No, for real. Okay. Now, what about the text that says that you're allowed to hate your fellow, the one who you see is not doing Torah and Mitzvos? So the Alter Rebbe turns it all the way around. As opposed to limiting the verse which says love your fellow as your friend and only talking about someone who's your equal in Torah and Mitzvos, he says the other way around. When it says you're allowed to hate the person, it's only someone who's your best buddy, you know him very well for all these years, you tried so hard to try to convince him to behave properly. You can see the text there, he says, he's close friend, close confidant, we've been studying together all this time, and I'm really trying to make him, and then it's still not working. That's the one guy that the Talmud says you're allowed to hate. That you're allowed to hate. Moreover, one second, let's finish this, 1 second. Moreover, we just finished saying that each person has a godly soul and an animal soul.
Yes.
The part of him that misbehaved came from where? The animal soul, the natural soul. The part of me that I'm loving is in the godly soul. So I love his godly soul and simultaneously dislike him and for his selfishness. So even while I dislike someone for their selfishness, it should not be a contradiction to the fact that I love the person because it's another Jew.
There's Chabad, yes.
That's correct. And therefore you may not like what he's doing.
But you have to love him.
That's right. So the limitation is, if the person's not your friend and he's not so close to you and you haven't tried that hard to make them better, so you can't hate at all. This person who happens to be very close to you, then only in that regard of that misbehavior you can hate him. But for the rest of him, you still love him because he's a godly soul.
That's how you talk to your kids.
Moreover, sorry?
We just want
Yeah.
to understand you're saying that just hate this behavior, this particular behavior of him, but not hate him, love
That's right.
him,
Right.
Because
hate his behavior.
that's correct. Because you've worked on yourself that your godly soul is primary, and therefore what you see in that other person is also their godly soul. That's pure and perfect. Love it. And moreover, and this takes to the next thing, if I truly love this person's godly soul, and it truly bothers me that the person misbehaved, not because I see this misbehaving as a competition to me, but because look at my friend is misbehaving, then the dislike for that misbehaving is not even hatred anymore. It ends up becoming pity. I feel so bad that a godly soul is stuck in such a behavior. So the love redeems the hate. It turns it around. It turns it into a sense of compassion, as opposed to contempt. And that's so. You want to know where Chabad exactly? This is where it's from.
I guess
This is where it all comes
I
from.
see where other forms of Judaism, where they take their,
Yeah. So I gave you all the sources, so no one can complain I only showed one side of the story. You got all the sources here, so if you want to back somebody else up, you have it here also. Okay. So in summary, I think we have two layers. Number one is the practical level, which is irrespective of how you feel about somebody. V'ahavta lireyacha, you behave cordially to that person, just on a practical level.
One question.
Yeah.
It says "Ve'ahavta l'reacha." It doesn't say your fellow Jew. It says
Yeah.
your fellow. So is
Yeah.
that directed towards
All of humanity?
The humanity, yeah.
Okay, that's a very good question. It's a very good question. And earlier we said that there were those who said not only does it doesn't even include all Jews, it's only your friend in Torah mitzvahs, right? So it's people limited more. You're taking an expansive view of it, right?
Yes.
Whereas others were taking it as a much more limited view. So you can go with the expansive if you want, right? But certainly the halachic, legal definition is to a fellow Jew.
Okay.
From the halachic perspective.
The halachic.
Yeah. So that's one level. The practical, even if, irrespective of how a person feels, love toward, behave cordially.
But
And then the
what
more,
halachic
yeah?
took a verse that is a general, l'reacha, and restricted it to your fellow Jew.
It's not exactly like that, because you have to go through all of Tanakh and see what the word reyacha means to decide that it's either expansive or inclusive. It's a serious study that the Talmud does, right?
Okay.
Trying to come to the conclusion what exactly this word reyacha means.
About that.
Of course, that's the whole discussion. What is the definition of this word fellow? What does that mean? Right? Even in the English, you saw one time it said countryman, the other time it said fellow man, the other time it said friend, and even to get that reyacha into English is not exactly so easy. And that's part of the discussion here. How do you define that? Right? Okay, so that was the first level, the practical level. And then on the spiritual level is a challenge to oneself to view that my own life should be motivated by not my own selfishness. In other words, putting it this way, when I see something that I don't like in somebody else, it should tell me that there's some part of me that sees that selfishness as a competition to my selfishness. And if the challenge to me is to move past that in me, and if I can move past that in me and get to the part of me that's godly and transcends selfishness, then that's what I'm going to see in the other person. And even if I simultaneously don't like the way they behave, I'm still going to love them / have compassion. Look at this poor fellow Jew who has a beautiful godly soul that's been dragged into such behavior. I encourage you to look at the text of the Tanya, and you'll see it all there, the beautiful language he uses to describe that a person should try his best to use chevle avoises ava. He says strong cords of love. I want you to see the line.
To say something that
One second.
just said,
Yeah.
that in the word rea,
Yeah.
it's like you said, it's a friend, but there is also the aspect of fra, that
Yeah. That's discussed as well.
That how
I want you to see the text on the bottom of page 7 and top page 8.
What was that word?
Re'acha. So he says, this is after, it's page 7, right in the middle of page 7. He says, this is after he explains that the limitation on when you're allowed to hate your friend, and he says only someone who's your close friend. Someone who's not your actual friend. Not just your friend, but he's not your close companion, right? But it's one who's not your companion, he's equal. Then of this Hill the elder said, be of the students of Aaron, love peace and love creatures, brios is creatures, and bring them close to the Torah. Comments the Alter Rebbe on the bottom, page 7. Loimar, meaning to say, even those who are distant from God's Torah and from His service. Which is why the Mishnah refers to them as creatures. Creatures, meaning to say their only virtue is that they were created. Even someone that low. You should, he says, you should turn creatures' inference to human beings means that even those who are far from God's Torah and His service for reasons they are classified simply as creatures, indicating the fact that God's creation is their sole virtue, even those one must attract with strong cords of love. Perhaps thereby, but they translate it as perhaps, but in Hebrew it's kula ha'ula, which means perhaps and only maybe you'll be able, after all, to draw them close to Torah and their observance. And even if you failed at getting them close to Torah, you still you'll have fulfilled the obligation of loving your fellow as yourself. That's the mantra that sets Chabad Shluchim out. All right, thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you.